I'm Robert Jones, and today we're going to look at a segment from my book, The Top 10 Innovations from World War I. And the one we're going to focus on is a segment of the chapter Trench Warfare on a Massive Scale, which was I rated number 9. Now, as you can see on that map there, the trenches in World War I went a long distance. And you can say that the defining feature of World War I was trench warfare. And many of the technological innovations that were developed in World War I were in reaction to that stalemate on the Western Front because of the trench warfare. So this could include things like poison gas and tanks and new kinds of machine guns, aerial bombing, etc. All of these were done to try to get around the stalemate on the Western Front. So World War I, of course, wasn't the first time that defensive structures on the battlefield were used in warfare. Back in the 17th century, a French engineer named Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban came up with a basic outline of trench warfare. Now, in his case, it was more being used for siege warfare if you were besieging a castle, and it would allow you to kind of dig your way closer to the castle every day. And certainly Petersburg and Atlanta in the American Civil War, especially Petersburg, were good examples of trench warfare being used for both offense and defense. But World War I was the poster child for trench warfare. The world's never seen anything like it before, and they've never seen anything exactly like it since, although there have been instances of trench warfare, such in the 1980s with the Iran-Iraq War. And there, that wonderful photo, you see Russian troops awaiting a German attack. You can see that the Russian trenches were not as nice to be in as perhaps, say, the German trenches were. So how did it happen? How did the Western Front get so frozen in World War I? Happened as far back as the beginning of the war, 1914. In September 1914, during the Battle of the Marne, Allied troops forced German troops to retreat back to the Aisne River. The Germans dug in, and this began what is now called the Race to the Sea, as each side dug in trenches and then tried to outflank the other. To counter the outflanking attempts, more and more trenches were built, and eventually the line stretched from the Belgian Channel town on the North Sea of Newport to the Swiss border near Belfort. Eventually there was 400 miles of continuous trenches, and it made flanking movements impossible. As offensive tactics and weapons hadn't kept up with defensive tactics, the result was a 3.5-year stalemate. Now, today you probably couldn't successfully create a Western Front in warfare because of modern explosives being delivered by F-16s and B-1s and that sort of thing. But back then they didn't have offensive weapons of that caliber, and it was the right time, the right place for such a stalemate to occur. So here's some characteristics of the trenches that you saw on both sides. Typically multiple parallel trench lines with diagonal or zigzag trenches running between them. Trenches were often up to 12 feet deep with a step-up platform for firing or for observation. There were often underground areas to protect men, supplies, and munitions from the heavy artillery fire that was so common during World War I. If you take a look at that diagram there, you see, at least in the rule book, how trenches were supposed to be built. You see there that it looks like they have brick or some sort of mortar, and they actually don't look too bad to be in. Well, certainly on the British side during World War II, trenches very rarely look that good. Occasionally they might have on the German side. Also, characteristics on both sides, there were usually small sentry posts or machine gun pits in front of the main trench lines. Now, sometimes these were trenches themselves that had been dug out into no man's land, and these trenches were sometimes called saps, and the people who dug them were called sappers. Both sides used barbed wire in front of trench lines to slow down an enemy attack. One of the problems with barbed wire, though, is that when your own men went over the top and went on to the attack, the barbed wire also slowed them down. And you see that wonderful color postcard there showing the Germans in one of their trenches. British trenches typically used 3 lines of trenches, and then they had some sort of traverses in them. The front line trench was where the troops went over the top when they were attacking the Germans or the Austrians. They often had loopholes that allowed frontline troops to view the enemy trenches without putting their heads above the trench rim. You could create these out of sandbags, sometimes even metal plates. Then there would be a second trench line known as the support trench, typically about a football field behind the front line trench. So ammunition, troops, other supplies could be brought up quickly from the support trench when needed during the battle. The third trench line was the reserve trench, often located 200 to 300 yards behind the support trench. This at least could provide some relief to troops if they went back into the reserve trench. They wouldn't be on the front line. The British, being the British, had a trench rotation. Typically, people would spend a week on the front line or in the front line trench, except during an offensive, of course, when it might be longer. Then they move back to the support trench for a week and a week in the reserve trench. And then they might get a week away from the line where they'd be able to go well behind the lines and maybe go to a town and enjoy some of the mysteries and pleasures you might find in a French town in the teens of the last century. At any one time, the British probably had about 1.1 to 1.2 million troops in their rotation. Being in that frontline trench, being expected to go over the top at any moment, was not an easy thing to do and had a very high casualty rate, of course. Now, German trenches were completely different. Unlike the British, the Germans used reinforced concrete. They created dugouts that were impermeable even to heavy artillery fire. They had ventilation systems. Troops could stay well underground for a long period of time, so if there was going to be a big bombardment of artillery, you could just put everybody down into these underground concrete bunkers and they could just wait out the bombardment. Germans also pioneered use of the pillbox as machine gun posts. No doubt you've seen those in movies on television. And they also used the idea of redoubts, which could provide enfilade fire during an attack. And this similar system of forts were used in Petersburg during the American Civil War in 1864-1865. Germans also used the idea of defense with depth. They would often build multiple lines of trenches to allow a strategic retreat back to a better defensive position. So let's say, for example, their frontline trenches were overrun. They could just have everybody retreat back, maybe a kilometer back to a brand new line of trenches, and then they'd just hop into trenches and they'd start firing all over again. And this actually was very effective, particularly in the beginning parts of the war. There's a wonderful drawing giving some idea of what the German trenches might look like. It also shows that much of it was underground. You see in the bottom of that diagram, you see miners digging underground tunnels. You see the traverses running between the different trench systems. You see what it looks like nearing the front lines. Very elaborate trench design. So why were the German trenches so much better than the British ones? Well, one of the reasons is, at least in the beginning of the war, the British thought that the trenches were just temporary and there was no reason to put all that effort into making them really solid and impermeable to artillery fire. Whereas the Germans, once they set their minds to building those trenches, they went all out. There's other topics associated with the trenches. When I do a live talk, we can talk about the Hindenburg Line. We can talk about what was life in the trenches like, and luckily we have a lot of first-hand accounts of that. We can look at the timeline of trench innovations. We can look at some of the countermeasures that were used against trench warfare. So thank you for listening to this segment, and I hope to talk to you in the future. Take care.